Welcome to the Ty Beal Show, where we discuss food, science, and life. I'm Ty Beal, a scientist at the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, or GAIN. My guest today is Dr. Stephan van Vliet, professor of nutrition at Utah State University. Dr. van Vliet is an expert in metabolomics research and a pioneer in understanding the nutritional dark matter in food, that is, the thousands of compounds we know little about. In our conversation, we explore how these compounds, like phytochemicals and antioxidants, influence health, how regenerative agriculture boosts nutrient density in foods like beef and bison, and what this means for rethinking nutrition and sustainable food systems. A quick note before we start. This podcast is separate from my role at GAIN. Okay, let's jump in. Dr. Stephan van Vliet, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Ty. It's a real pleasure.
Yeah, well, I'm so happy to talk to you and explore all of the work you've been doing in the last several years. So to get us started here, can you explain what nutritional dark matter is? What does that mean? Why are these thousands of unstudied compounds in our food so important for health?
Yeah, so the dark matter of nutrition is the stuff that does not appear in your nutrition facts panel, but it's probably pretty important for your health. That's the easiest way of saying it. But, when we think of things that do appear in the nutrition facts panel, which would be protein, fat, carbohydrate, sugar, right, and a handful of vitamins and minerals, there's about 13 that routinely appear. That is literally the tip of the iceberg of the complexity of nutrition, because foods may contain thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands compounds that are capable of impacting our health. So if you sort of picture this on a pie, we've cut out 1% of the slice of the pie, but what about the other 99%? And we've had a particular interest in those, right? Maybe a good example would be a blueberry. A blueberry contains some carbohydrates, some sugar, and some B vitamins and minerals. But why does one eat a blueberry? You eat it for the antioxidants, the anthocyanidins, which are a type of flavonoid. That's why we eat blueberries, because they don't provide a lot of other caloric value. So that could be a good example of the nutritional dark matter.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, when we eat food, we typically don't really think about, probably most people don't think about much, but if you do think about something nutritional, it's, how much protein is in it, how many calories, things like that, right? Just a tiny fraction of the nutrients are actually shown on a nutrition facts panel. So there's this huge amount of compounds, thousands of compounds that are really underexplored. So how do you study these? You got interested in metabolomics. Kind of what sparked your interest in that? And how do you understand what actually is in these foods? How do you get to this level of detail?
So what first sparked is during my PhD many years ago, we did a study where we compared whole eggs versus egg whites. And at that time, the leading thought was that the protein content is sort of the end-all be-all in determining muscle protein synthesis rate. So in that study, we gave young men, after resistance exercise, egg whites or whole eggs. And while the whole eggs, their protein and digestion absorption was delayed due to the fat present in the whole eggs, what we actually found was that the whole eggs gave a higher muscle anabolic response, which could not be explained by the protein content because that was matched to the egg whites. And even conventional wisdom at that time would tell you, well, if you eat fat with your protein, the protein digestion absorption is delayed, and that is a bad thing for your muscle. It delays the muscle protein synthetic response. But we found the exact opposite. So it was what we hypothesized was that it was the bioactive compounds within the yolk, carotenoids, peptides, and other things that are in there that are probably aiding in the muscle anabolic response, because they can impact cell signaling pathways. And that is really when the dark matter of nutrition gets interesting, because those, what we call secondary metabolites, and we call them secondary because in the past we didn't really know what they did, and we knew they weren't essential to life, but it turns out they are pretty important. They can impact cell signaling pathways. They can even do as much as impact insulin signaling in the absence of glucose. They can maybe even cross our blood-brain barrier, where they have all these metabolic effects. So that's when I first got interested in that.
Fascinating.
And and then studying that, we use a technique that is called metabolomics, which is a fancy way of saying the study of metabolites. So we experience metabolism as we sit here.
Hmm.
Plants experience metabolism, soils experience metabolism, other animals, and many of those metabolites can serve as nutrients to us. So that's the technique of metabolomics is really the broad study of metabolites, many of which we now know that have um, potential health effects. Amino acids, fatty acids, vitamins. These are all metabolites, but that's probably, as we said, mapping out 1%. And while these things are very important, the other 99% seems to be impacting our metabolism and health as well. And we've really focused over the last few years to study those. And sometimes they're also known as phytonutrients because a lot of these things are very rich in plants.
Mm.
They can also become rich in animals because the grazing animal, takes these plants and turns these phytonutrients into mammalian metabolites, or if it's a mammal, but in the case of a cow, which would be in very similar versions as we find in our body, in addition to some unique ones because we're not ruminants and there's certain plants we can't eat.
Yeah. So many of these nutrients that you're talking about, that this 1%, are things that we are familiar with, like amino acids, vitamins, minerals. These are tend to be essential nutrients. What is it about these other nutrients that they're not deemed essential right now, but still potentially have health benefits or health effects?
Well, they're deemed non-essential because if you don't eat them, you don't die.
That's a low bar.
That's Yeah, that's the bar here essentially,
Okay.
right? Because that's why we know vitamins are essential because if you don't eat vitamin C, you get scurvy, and eventually you'll die. If you
Yeah.
don't eat thiamine, you get beriberi, and eventually you will die, right? And that's what it is. And the same with essential amino acids. Now, that is not to say that the other stuff is not important, and I think it doesn't explain everything, of course, but part of the hypothesis, at least, and what both epidemiological studies and randomized controls would suggest, and also in vitro studies where you look at mechanisms, is that the absence of these phytonutrients, these flavonoids, polyphenols, lignans, isoflavones within our diet that we are consuming in much lower concentrations because we're mostly consuming a standard American diet that is very refined and that is low in fruits and vegetables, and um, that we're not getting a lot of those compounds, and that may be one of the reasons why we're not in optimal metabolic health. And we see these rising rates of cancer, Alzheimer's, diabetes, obesity. Granted, this is obviously always going to be multifactorial. Stress would impact that, lack of sleep, environmental toxins, you name it. Um, but if we uh, ingest more of these phytonutrients, we're probably better equipped to handle these things that may induce oxidative stress to us.
Yeah. Okay. So these nutrients or these compounds, you're talking a lot about phytonutrients, polyphenols, things, flavonoids, things like that. And those are from plants. What about animals? Do the animal products we consume also contain other compounds that are not essential but have health effects?
They do. It could be something else that is maybe well studied, such as taurine or anserine. Taurine named after Taurus, anserine named after the Latin name for duck. Those are, for instance, amino acids and peptides. Creatine is another one, right? That is maybe not essential, but we are learning that this is important for our cognitive health, for rapid energy production, also in the brain. Um, so these are things that appear within the animal as well. But there's also one thing that we've been studying and we've been interested in is what you feed the animal during its finishing phase or its life. How does that impact the nutritional composition? Because
Mm,
much like us, if we eat a diet that is rich in diversity, whether it be animal or plant diversity, but in the compounds of an herbivore, it would obviously be plant diversity. So if cows are grazing these diverse mixtures of plants on pasture, um, what we are seeing is that there's a flow of these phytochemicals, many of which we were able to catalog and have not found in the human metabolome because it's from plants that we cannot eat. Those get metabolized by the animal, oftentimes turn into uh, what we describe as mammalian antioxidants. And what we're what I am pretty confident in stating is that they benefit the metabolic health of the animal. So they have better mitochondrial health, they have better welfare, they have less oxidative stress. And on paper, at least, it makes the, for instance, grass-fed beef look more complex, at least, or more nutrient dense in these phytonutrients from the flow of these phytochemicals from plant to animal. Whether that has an appreciable health effect on us, that's something that is an ongoing active investigation, and we don't really know that. But what I do feel comfortable saying is that the animal would definitely be metabolically healthier, and then the question is, does that make it healthier for us?
Wow. So do I understand correctly that there are actually unique phytochemicals that we cannot obtain through plants because they're not an edible species, but we can actually obtain those through the animal that consumes those species?
That's correct. Yeah, when we annotated
Wow.
the fruits, yeah, we definitely see compounds that are, as of yet, to the best of our knowledge, not cataloged in the human metabolome, and you can trace that back to the plants. And then, yeah, these are plants that, for whatever the reason, I mean, I think we can well accept that we cannot eat grass because of the high cellulose and lignin content, right?
Yeah.
But it's also very much other plants that may be inedible for us due to other reasons. Maybe being very bitter, or we just cannot simply digest them because of the cell wall content. So, yes, these are compounds that can have potential, yeah, or at least they have ascribed health benefits in more laboratory models. Whether this has a health benefit to us, that's we're early innings into that, but. Yeah, that is the unique part of ruminants or grazing animals, is that we can upcycle a lot of compounds within the meat and milk products, and they also get flavored to it. Because maybe it's another important thing is that why do people buy Alpine cheeses, or why do people buy pecorino cheese, or from sheep grazed on Sardinian mountain pastures, or from cows grazed on alpine pastures? Because these are very phytochemically rich pastures, and it actually impacts the flavor of the cheese. And
Wow.
I think we have an appreciative of that, right? And uh, from a European perspective, that's definitely something that's been well appreciated, and it's almost akin to maybe the wine industry, where you can taste the terroir, which would be the territory, right? You can taste the land.
Wow. That's fascinating. So you've compared, as you're mentioning, these pasture finished beef systems versus grain fed, right? For beef. You mentioned that there are sometimes actually unique phytochemicals, but what about the phytochemicals that are in plants already? Do you see a lot of these in the pasture raised beef, or do you see more in the grain fed beef? How do those compare when you take a look at them from a metabolomics perspective?
Yeah, so that's where it becomes interesting, because the parent compounds. So we test total mixed ration samples, which are akin to which are basically the grain-based concentrates fed to animals in the feedlot, and then we also collect pasture samples. When we study those, we can see uh, a, a large difference in many of these flavonoids, polyphenols, phenolics being several hundred to thousands of percent higher. So total mixed rations provide a good amount of protein and energy, but they are not very rich in these antioxidant compounds. When you actually go to the animal, and this also made the research initially very challenging, because, and that's maybe a funny backstory, uh, but the compounds that appear in the forage are not the same as they appear in the animal. The animal, it goes to phase one and phase two metabolism in the gut, and then the liver, and it turns these compounds into different compounds that are metabolized. They have some of the hydroxy groups change. They are bound to amino acids. They're bound to sugar, so they're getting transformed.
Hmm.
So, and the interesting anecdote on this was, when we started this work, people in the past had studied this. And let's say you take a compound like benzoic acid, which is a very dominant phenolic in green grasses or in green plants in general. When that enters the animal, it turns it into 2,6-dihydroxybenzoic acid, or 3,4-dihydroxybenzoic acid, or a different version, right? Now, in sort of the older literature, people could measure benzoic acid, and then if you measure it using photospectrometry, you actually uh, probably see it appearing in animal source food as benzoic acid. We started to do that on an MSMS, where we can actually measure the molecular weight of these things and the specific structure of these. And we're measuring this, and we're like, "Oh, this is not here. There's no benzoic acid in these products, in the meat and milk, despite of what was mentioned in literature." And then we found out, well, they're actually similar compounds, but their structure has been slightly altered, meaning that their spectra, or their fingerprints, as well as their molecular weight, was slightly altered. So that took a while to figure out and to understand the complex pathways. And but I think well, we're still learning a lot, of course, but we are, I think, at a point where we can help predict some of these pathways and measure some of these intermediates. And what was really interesting also is that we studied breast milk or the breast milk literature in humans actually was very helpful to understand how these things are being metabolized, because that's ultimately also a mammal. We are mammals too, right? And one thing we found is that you actually get a lot of these metabolites already in mammalian versions. So it's basically another way of getting metabolized polyphenols within our body. And whether that makes them more bioavailable or not, we don't know. Maybe it's something like heme iron versus non-heme iron, right? Where
Yeah.
both of them contribute, but we know that the heme iron coming into a heme structure is more bioavailable from animal source foods. Maybe something similar. I do want to highlight, though, that it does not mean you shouldn't eat plants. Plants are a better source of phytochemicals. The way we see animal source foods is that they are additive, bring metabolized versions of those, which could have benefits, and in addition, very unique compounds that could otherwise not be obtained by the plants that are edible for human consumption.
So we can't get out of eating our fruits and vegetables. We can't
I,
just.
I would I would argue no. I would say, like, again, and maybe there will be a little bit of pushback from if someone's on a carnivore diet, but for me, if I look at this from a human nutrition standpoint, and I look at what fruits and vegetables contain, and then I look at what animal source foods contain, and I see no good reason I exclude either one. In fact, I see many reasons why it would be beneficial to include both within the diet.
Yeah. Well, I fully agree. I think for most listeners out there, keep eating your fruits and vegetables. But it really is clear that what the animal eats impacts what the nutritional value of the food is. And it sounds like we still have a lot to learn about the health impacts of that for us. There's already benefits for the animal, which I think is a win. What about in terms of the farming system? So, what about things like soil health in regenerative farming? Does those practices influence the presence of compounds like flavonoids or any other things in crops and livestock?
They do, yes. Typically, what we're seeing is in more regenerative systems, or systems that have better soil health, you see a better interaction between the plant and the soil microbes. So let's say you have more life in the soil, that tends to benefit the health of the plant by taking up various nutrients from the soil. It also helps with nutrient cycling. Um, Another thing that we're seeing is in biodiverse systems, you typically see a higher phytochemical richness as opposed to monocultures. And maybe an analogy would be if I run a marathon and there's a competition amongst runners within the marathon, we're probably going to run faster. All of us are going to run
Yeah.
faster. If it's just several clones of me running it, we're probably not going to run as fast, because there's competition is less. So a little bit of a healthy competition amongst plants is good, and it's not just competition. A lot of times it's synergy. If you look at natural systems, right, and it's I don't want to. You could argue that most of humans are part of nature. So, but let's say in wild systems,
Yeah.
you typically see great diversity, right? And if you see only one plant, there's usually something wrong. If you only see one herbivore, you typically don't see that either, right? You see a
Yeah.
plethora of plants that have their ecological niche. You see a plethora of animals that have the ecological niche. So that biodiversity seems to be a strong predictor in terms of nutrient density. And perhaps not surprising, but if you look at the soil science, you also see that plant diversity is a strong predictor of soil health as well. And I think that provides a strong link between soil health and human nutrition, where sort of biodiversity sitting at the centerpiece of this, and having a beneficial effects across that soil, plant, animal, human health continuum.
Right. Okay. So in this comparison here, do you have a trial ongoing where you're looking at differences between regenerative and conventional type of agriculture?
We do. We did complete a very large beef project that was looking at grass-fed beef or pasture-finished beef, I should say, compared to feedlot finished beef. What we found there was indeed large differences. One of the interesting parts was also just the variation, but as a group level, we saw that there was higher levels of phytochemicals, higher levels of carotenoids as well, um, a little bit higher levels of certain minerals. Interestingly, calcium was one of them. Now you would argue, well, Stefan, beef is not a good source of calcium. I agree, but what that probably indicates, but dark green leafy vegetables are a good source of calcium, right?
Mhm.
So the cows eat their equivalent of dark green leafy vegetables. But zinc and iron was also slightly higher, whereas in the B vitamins we didn't really find much of a difference. But that's also because it has part to do with the total mixed rations being designed to be uh, rich in B vitamins and protein. Coming back to sort of this more simplified approach to essential nutrition, whereas you meet the energy needs of the animal, you meet the protein needs, and you meet the B vitamin needs, which is something we have strived for in our own food system as well through the widespread fortification.
Ah, okay. So it's kind of like us, eating all these highly processed foods that have been sort of stripped of a lot of their nutritional value, but we add in some, iron and zinc, have some protein powder, and we call it good.
Well, yeah, maybe not. It's a potential analogy. Yes, yes, of course. Like um, obviously, total mixed rations, they do provide less of these phytonutrients, which we also typically see within our own diets because we're eating more refined products as opposed to a diversity of plant and animal sources in this case. But in the animals case, it would be less plant diversity. So there's that, and it's not to say that there's no place for maybe grain feeding or byproduct upcycling, right? I mean,
Mhm.
in traditional farming systems, I'm not advocating that we go back to the 1800s, but it was quite common to have mixed systems where the animal would eat some grains or graze. Or get again has byproducts or graze spent crop fields, put nutrients back in, prime it for the next growing season, right? And it would consume maybe some residue that was left behind after harvesting. So, and we actually worked with the various producers that were, for instance, pasture finished with grain on pasture. And they, maybe their local brewery had a bunch of spent brewer's grain, and they could pick it up for $0 and feed it to their animals. And some of these were indistinguishable from grass-fed
Oh,
samples. Yeah, so
oh,
that so it's not a black or white thing, and the same thing in sort of more feedlot systems when people fed like more diverse rations. In some cases, those samples also look better than some grass-fed samples, especially the ones that were maybe grazed on more monoculture and less diverse pastures. So it's not black and white, but we tend to think of these things as black and white, right? 100% grass fed or
yeah.
feedlot finished, where it's like,
It's all or
okay,
nothing.
yeah, it's all or nothing, right? And
Yeah.
we try to push the animals up to as much grain as we reasonably can, and while that fattens them up quickly, and one could argue that's maybe efficient in some ways, um, it does seem that that is maybe not. Uh, Ideal, or at least you have, and if that's acceptable, it is acceptable, but you have some reductions in the health of the animal. Because if you study the metabolome of the animal, you also get a good insight into their metabolic health. And
Mhm.
you do see all the classic diminishments that you would expect with decrease in metabolic health, reduced mitochondrial health, worsened glucose control, more oxidative stress, uh, things that are very similar to the human phenotype as well when we eat diets that are probably not as uh, healthy for us as they can be.
So how many? So I want to just kind of have a comparison to see for people who aren't aware. If you think about a feedlot animal, right? It doesn't mean that the cow does not graze in pasture, until the last 6 months. But in that 6 months, how many different sources are they getting? Because I know in the kind of very diverse what you're calling regenerative agriculture, some of your papers have looked at, there's over 100 different species of grasses and forbs and legumes, right? What is it like in a feedlot? How many different crops are there?
Yeah, it depends. I mean, it depends. Usually, a lot of it is availability of what is locally available, but it is the dominant portion of that would be corn. That's very common, and as well as some inclusion of hay, and that hay might be very diverse, or it might be alfalfa hay. It depends on, but if it's hay from local pastures, it might still contain a plethora of different plants. Um, but one of the things there too is that, and I do realize we cannot graze whole year round everywhere, but when you turn fresh green forages into hay or silage, and you can kind of already see that the color has changed a lot, right? You
Yeah.
actually reduce, particularly the phenolic compounds, maybe not so much the minerals, because those are elements which are very stable actually, but some of these phytochemicals they are not as stable, so you have a great reduction in that. And what we typically found is that we tested forages, fresh forages, and those contains in many cases several thousand% more of the compound when you turn that exact same pasture into hay or silage. So you see a
Wow.
reduction already. And then corn, we also tested just corn of itself, which may make up 70, 80% of the ration in some cases. If you test the corn itself, especially the field corn, right, the feed corn, um, that is quite low in phytochemical antioxidants, very low actually.
Wow. That's it's kind of such a stark difference when you think about the diets, and what you're saying is it's not just that these feedlot animals are consuming primarily corn compared to, like 100 different species or more of different foods that they can eat. It's also that it's not fresh. The drying process, all of that really reduces the phytochemical content. So overall, you're saying regenerative agriculture has benefits to to animal health, animal welfare, potentially more biodiversity on the land, and now we're starting to try to understand what does that do for health. Do you have any early insights about how these are affecting our health? Like if I eat the regenerative burger, is that going to make a difference for me personally when I eat that?
Right. It may, but the question is, or a big, we see this as a bigger picture is diet quality. If that burger is being eaten as part of a standard American diet, I would say probably doesn't matter as much because it's like just one thing that you change, right? But if
Yeah.
part of an overall healthy diet, then these things may play out. I mean, we've been studying circulating omega-3 fatty acids because that's been probably been a handful of studies that have looked at that in the past, probably maybe a dozen or so that looked at grass fat versus grain fat or pastured versus non-pastured, looking across lamb, beef, chicken, eggs. Typically what they find is that consumers of pastured livestock products, they, such as grass-fed beef, have higher circulating omega-3 fatty acid levels after about 8 to 12 weeks or so. Um,
Interesting.
that is what we're finding as well. So it does point to the fact that, and while salmon is a much better source of omega-3 fatty acids than grass-fed beef, it does seem like it can contribute meaningfully, especially because in a real-world scenario, people eat more uh, beef, chicken, pork, and eggs than they do salmon,
Hmm.
right? And that's not to say you shouldn't eat salmon a couple of times a week, but just the magnitude of which those land animal products are being consumed, they can make a meaningful difference. So that's maybe not a hard endpoint because no one develops heart disease in our 4 month randomized controlled trial. Thank God. Otherwise, I probably have a
Yeah.
lot of explaining to do.
Yeah.
But if over time that should, in theory, translate to reduced risk of Alzheimer's, reduced risk of heart disease, reduced risk of cancer, right? Because high levels of circulating omega-3 fatty acids are associated with that. So uh, that is what we can look at in terms of health benefits. Other things that we're looking at right now is the circulating metabolites transfer from the animal into the human. We're finding that that is also the case, but again, we're looking at circulating metabolome profile. So while maybe on paper you might have more of these metabolites, um, again, I cannot fully state like, okay, this is going to improve our health, but it's, over time those things could play out, and that's when we look at the epidemiological data where we try to wet. Now, granted, there's not really any studies asking, do you consume grass-fed beef versus grain-fed beef? And my guess would be if we did that in studies, the associations with red meat with metabolic disease would probably be a lot lower. And maybe it has nothing to do with the beef, but my guess is that people eat grass-fed beef, or it's not like guess, we know this from other studies, is they also consume more fruits and vegetables. They tend to be more active, exercise more. They tend to drink less. They tend to smoke less. They tend to gamble less, or
other healthy behaviors.
Yeah, other healthy behaviors, indeed. So those are things that we're typically seeing. But one thing we're seeing, Ty, is that even when you consume foods from conventional agriculture, or even feedlot beef, if you consume a bunch of whole foods. So we did a randomized controlled trial where we fed people a whole food diet, both from regenerative and conventional agriculture, and just not eating a standard American diet is by far the biggest driver. Okay. So just eating some fruits and vegetables, and leaving the ultra processed breakfast sausages away, and then eating some minimally processed animal source foods alongside whole grains, a bunch of fruits and vegetables, just makes you pretty healthy pretty quickly.
Okay, so the bigger picture is still diet quality overall. What you're eating really matters. It's kind of like key, but it does sound like it will add up, because I think if you're able to detect a change in a biomarker in just the course of a few weeks, if that's sustained over somebody's lifetime, there could be meaningful health impacts. So I think for those of us who really care about trying to optimize health, if you're already eating a healthy diet, choosing these more regenerative type of products could actually translate to some health improvement. And in either way, it's probably better for the animal and the environment anyway. So you've also done a lot of work on plant-based meats and kind of comparing them to animal products. And I'd love to hear, one of your studies, you were kind of comparing a plant-based meat to a grass-fed beef burger and looking at the metabolites and the differences. Can you tell us about those key findings, and what did you learn from that?
Yeah, what we learned is that despite a very comparable nutrition facts panel, because the plant-based meat used a soy protein isolate and fortified it with all the B vitamins and minerals commonly found in meat, or at least brought them up to those levels, because there was probably some contribution just from the ingredients that it contained. So you look at the nutrition facts panel, you're thinking, okay, similar amount of protein, similar amount of saturated fat, similar amount of total fat, similar amount of vitamins and minerals. But then if you look under the hood a little bit, they're actually 90% different, and as different as you expect a plant and an animal to be. Because when you look at a broader metabolome profile, soybean is quite different than beef. And despite both being protein, they are not nutritionally interchangeable by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah, okay. And I hear a lot of people talk about how things are nutritionally equivalent, right? Sort of substitution, like just replace the animal product with the plant-based alternative. And like you said on the nutrition facts panel, maybe that's the case. And certainly for a lot of products, it's actually not the case. Many of the plant-based products may have lower protein or lower protein quality or lower mineral content. But even if it is the case, this process of combining added or isolated ingredients with a few fortified nutrients to try to get the key handful of nutrients that are on the nutrition facts panel doesn't really translate into that being the same product. So in this study, you have a figure where you kind of show that the difference in metabolites is something like 90% different. So I interpreted that as it's sort of the foods, these plant-based meats versus the grass-fed meat is actually potentially more different than it is similar. Can you explain what that really looks like, and what does that mean for our health?
Yeah, what it means for our health in the short term, probably not that much. And there's some elegant work that was done by Dr. Gardner at Stanford, right? Who compared Beyond Beef with a lot of grass-fed meat products, and found that in the short term, there was a reduction in cholesterol with the plant-based meats, and I think that was one of the main biomarkers that moved. Not really difference in inflammatory profiles. What I'm thinking of also, and again, it can hypothesize or infer what would happen over time, but there's things like taurine, anserine, creatine, cysteamine. Maybe those things are like a lot of amines, but these are things that we know impact our health. And how that would play out over 30, 40 years, or even multi-generational, that is probably where I worry about it, right? And you may not start to have any neurocognitive effects in the short term of that, but could you have effects of that in the long term? And what also makes it sometimes difficult with this in a real world scenario, right? If you switch out meat with a plant-based alternative, it typically means that most people that do that tend to do other health benefits, right? Like, let me clean up my diet. My doctor said I shouldn't eat red meat anymore, and we should eat red meat and stop smoking and drinking and do other stuff, right? So that's why it's like you might feel better or in the short term, but for me, just looking at this like from a nutritional standpoint, is that I worry about like the absence of these compounds that are, despite being non-essential in our diet, but that we know have a health benefit that could play out over time, or the absence of those could play out over time. And I mean, of course, um, you sometimes see this in children in particular, right? Where unless the plant-based or vegan diet, I mean, I like the word plant-based is usually used in terms of plant exclusive, but a vegan or plant exclusive diet, unless that is very well formulated and supplemented, there's actually in children you can see that there may be a detrimental effect, right? Whereas maybe in adults these things might not play out or play out much more slowly because we are not going through a rapid stage of growth anymore. We're more trying to hold on for our life in many ways. So those are things that I think are important to note. So that these products are so nutritionally different that even though their protein content may be the same, you're getting a way different nutritional profile. And for that reason, I don't think the nutrition is changeable. And then we hypothesize that in the paper to an extent, or put it in the context of the broader literature, that the absence of these compounds may matter over time, meaning that humans being biologically omnivores, that the way that we interpret that, based on not just that, but that's sort of the bigger picture discussion in that paper, means that this doesn't mean that either plant or animals or fruits are optional, but we actually derive benefits from eating both.
Yeah. Well, I can say personally, I'm an omnivore. I eat a lot of plants. But one thing that is fascinating to me is that when I eat a meal with sort of tofu as the main protein source versus having some meat, I don't feel as good. I don't know what's going on there. I've heard of a term called meat factor. Maybe you can tell me what's going on. But what would it be that I feel like I'm missing something? I mean, I do lots of times. I'll do meals where it's just tofu, or I'll do like lentil pasta or something. But if I go one or two meals, it feels like my body is craving some meat, even if it's not a lot. What's going on there?
Yeah, I mean, that is known as the meat factor, and it's interesting you point out because they call it the meat factor. We don't really know what it is, right? But people have hypothesized about that. But it's based on data, interventional data, that if you provide, for instance, there have been some elegant studies done on eating legumes with beef, is that actually the uptake of iron from the legumes is higher when you eat it with beef. Suggesting that there's an additive effect, or that the uptake of these nutrients seem to become additive or synergistic, and that's called the meat factor or meat factors. These might be things like taurine, it might be things like anserine, it might be other peptides. In milk, it might be lactoferrin that can help take up more iron and zinc and other minerals and potentially other nutrients as well. And that is what is called the meat factor. So it's that coming back to the sort of this idea that meat isn't just protein; it's a whole meat metabolome, and you get this wide variety of nutrients that probably work synergistically together in ways that we do not fully understand, that help with the uptake of vitamins and minerals and can even make things in plants more bioavailable. And then to turn it around, we're sometimes concerned about, for instance, advanced glycation end products or
Mm-hmm.
other maybe hydrocarbons or other heterocyclic amines, things like such as that are maybe formed with heating of the meat. But it actually turns out that, again, nice in vitro digestion studies would suggest that if you marinate your meat, if you eat it with plant foods, that you get the formation of those compounds um, that those are severely reduced as a result. So it kind of comes back as like you obtain the goods from the meat and obtain the goods from the plant as a result as well. And the plant can maybe result in you decreasing the quote unquote bad that you may get from the meat, particularly in terms of grilled meat when these things may be formed.
So plants playing a protective role against the potential negative aspects of meat, and meat obviously giving a benefit in nutrient density and other things. And one of the things that I sort of noticed, the way I would describe it is I don't feel the same level of satiation or fullness. And if I eat I have the plant-based meal, which I still do a lot, but like an hour or two later, I can feel hungry again or like something's missing. It's just something that I know everyone's different. Some people really thrive on a fully plant-based diet.
Yeah.
So I recognize that. Me personally, it feels like if I don't have at least a little bit of meat in the diet, I feel like I'm lacking something, even if all my micronutrients are fine.
Yeah, that's true, and that seems to be, and that also comes back to sort of the inter-individual differences. Is that people operate on a spectrum, right? And some people might feel very good on a diet that is on either spectrum, being very rich in animal source foods and or very rich in plant source foods. Whereas I think most of the people will operate on more closer to the middle, right? And that's
Yeah.
typically what you see. Um, so for most of the population, there's always exceptions, right? And you can always come across anecdotes uh, to the opposite. I mean, it's kind of like I was one thing that just immediately popped to mind is that if you uh, we say this with nuclear fallouts, right? If you drop a nuclear bomb, some people still got 95 that lived in Hiroshima, right? But most of
Hmm.
us would die of cancer and
Right.
radiation poisoning, right? So there's always exceptions to the rule. My point being is that there's such inter-individual differences between humans that, and it's not to compare per se a plant-exclusive diet with dropping a nuclear bomb on you. I'm not saying that, but it comes back to the fact that um, you have these wide genetic differences, and that some people may do very well on a lifelong vegan diet, but extrapolating that to that everyone will do well on that um, is not the same. Coming back to the few people that maybe survived a nuclear fallout doesn't mean that nuclear radiation is harmless.
Right. Exactly. And I think if we think of this as like a distribution, you see this bell curve on the ends. There are going to be people who thrive with more or less animal products, right? More or less plant foods, but most of us seem to do well somewhere in the middle range, or what may call moderate amount of animal products. And I think there's room for everyone, so we don't have to get into the diet wars. That's for sure. Um, do you have any sort of unexpected findings from your recent work? Something that changed how you view food or its role in our health?
Well, one of the unexpected findings always is how complex food is. That I'm still convinced that even if we've really um, focused very hard on studying as many phytonutrients as we can and quantifying those. And we've really pushed the needle on that and in the last few years in developing assays for that and to yeah, get our research group at the forefront of that. But I still feel the deeper we go into it, I still feel that it is true. It may sound a little cliche, but the more you learn about something, the less you realize you know about it. Because I feel like we're really scratching the surface on this, even though we are studying so many compounds nowadays. So that is probably an eye-opening part of it. Um, Also, another thing that pops to mind in general is that with crops, also just the effect of cultivar, right? In regenerative systems, uh, probably you may need to grow also more, yeah, I should say crops that are more adapted to less inputs, that may be a little bit more hardy, that can survive or compete amongst diverse plants, right? So you also have this point as like one thing I'm thinking of is that just growing, even if it's a non-GMO variety of our yellow dent number 2, the corn. If you try to grow those in a regenerative low input system, turns out the corn is not that nutritious at all. So it doesn't mean that regenerative agriculture is always like a sure thing, if that makes sense, because that variety was bred to be grown in an environment where it do very well on regular nitrogen application, on
Yeah.
mineral fertilization, and all of a sudden you pull that, the plant doesn't grow very well anymore. That same variety. So that's an important nuance, I think. Also, if we're moving more towards regenerative agriculture, you may have to develop different hybrids as well that can do well in with less inputs.
That makes a lot of sense. You have to do it in the right way. Can't just take our conventional varieties and expect them to thrive in a regenerative system. So, how about in terms of practical application for people from some of your findings and what we've talked about when people are shopping at grocery stores? I've seen a little bit more some of these labeling, which I don't know how much, if any, regulation there is on this, but you see regenerative, the milk that says regeneratively produced or from a regenerative farm. You see pasture raised eggs. How much do these things matter? Can you help maybe for the average shopper who's going to the grocery store? What would you advise them? I know overall diet quality matters, but what other things can they do to make sure they're trying to get healthy foods?
Yeah, well, the main thing is indeed not consuming a standard American diet, right? So skip the drive-through in the middle aisles, of course. But okay, within that framework, um, I would say, and this is also another part maybe of regenerative agriculture that's not always per se appreciated. If you produce foods that are more nutrient dense, they tend to taste better, right? Think about it like carrots. I mean, I don't know. I mean, yeah, you have children. If they like eating carrots, maybe the bland stuff from the grocery store, not so much, but a
The
fresh
purple
carrot,
ones. Yeah,
the
the
purple
purple
ones.
ones are their favorite too. All
Yeah,
those anthocyanins.
that's right. That's right. Or carrots that are just very fresh and have this deep flavor, right? Those actually taste good. And so just a matter of having fruits and vegetables give this complex flavor where actually it could maybe quote unquote compete with our Doritos and other very tasty snacks, right?
Yeah.
Might be just also very important, because so I think in that case, if you're able to uh, get it maybe from local farmers, from farmers markets, probably to the farmers market on a Saturday instead of the grocery store, you'll find that a lot of those fruits and vegetables actually have a much more complex flavor, partly of the way they're grown, partly because they're picked at peak ripeness. And it actually is quite enjoyable maybe to just munch on a carrot. So I think that's another important part for consumers as well. While it also supports your local farmer, it might also actually make you enjoy whole foods. And the one thing I've noticed, and I've probably noticed this on myself many years ago, but also heard it anecdotally, even when you switch over from a standard American diet to a whole foods diet, things may taste bland initially because you're such used to these artificial flavors and sugar, right? But after a while, you might start to appreciate the nuances of some plain oatmeal, because you're really kind of retraining your palate to start to appreciate that. And that's usually a phase
Yeah.
that people come through. But we oftentimes hear it in our diet studies, where we give people whole foods that maybe first couple of weeks they're not that happy about it, and a few weeks in they're like, oh, this actually tastes good now. I can kind of enjoy these things. I enjoy the nuances of these vegetables, because you're not on this ultra processed food right anymore. So you have to mighty get through it. So maybe initially
Right.
you're like, well, I don't like eating carrots or broccoli or these turnips. It doesn't taste like anything, but you'll probably over a while start to appreciate those flavors.
Yeah, I can relate to that. Anytime, and maybe it's when I'm traveling or whatnot, but if I shift to a lot of more highly processed foods that have been sort of formulated to be very appealing, a lot of really, hyper palatable characteristics, flavors. I do change my palate. Like I come back, maybe I come back home and I'm like, I don't want to eat this stuff that I typically eat. Takes me a while to get back into that. And then I think the other thing you mentioned is sort of eating foods that are more fresh, that are picked at peak ripeness, more in season, makes such a difference. With my kids, this happens all the time, but they're used to having the foods that are, pretty flavorful, right? Tomatoes that are, the more flavorful ones. And when they have one that is very bland, it really turns them off and they're like, oh, I don't like tomatoes or I don't like carrots, right? But then they have a really flavorful one, like you're saying, that's really fresh and has all those phytonutrients and everything. It really does make a difference. It's kind of impressive how quickly our palates can adjust to new ways of eating, though. That's encouraging, at least.
Yeah, I agree with that, and that's probably one of the ways to appreciate whole foods and foods that are grown maybe regeneratively that have higher levels of those compounds. If it's just the flavor aspect of that and getting actually people to eat it, if it contributes to that and ecological benefits, I think that's also a thing that we shouldn't underestimate.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, so what's next for your research? You're still working on things here. What can we expect in the coming years? Are you expanding any of your work? Really trying to look at this regenerative, but also what's the health impact on humans? Or are you exploring any new foods or studies?
Yeah, all of the above. We definitely started this from the livestock perspective, meaning that we'd studied meat in particular, beef in the beginning, started to add chicken, pork. But now, especially over the last year or two, um, we can basically study all foods now. So we've figured out how to best do that, and the extract. I won't bore the listeners with all of the ins and outs, but it's if you have different foods, you might have to process them or extract them slightly differently. But we've expanded our essays now to, I always jokingly say, as long as you don't send us a rock, I feel pretty confident we can extract the compounds and at least study them within the food. So yeah, we've been doing more work on crops, which would be grains. We tested a good amount of grains as well: corn, wheat, oats, fruits, strawberries, blueberries, potatoes as well. A lot of it is actually farmers. They can also just submit, or brands, they can just submit samples to us. I mean, we initially started with this from a research angle, but then, as we presented our work, we oftentimes get these requests from farmers or other brands that would be like, well, can we send you some samples as well? And can you do similar analysis on them? And so that's part of the work is definitely grown, where we have our lab set up now as a obviously a non-profit because we're in a university, but in many ways a commercial service lab where people can just submit samples to us, to the Van Vliet lab, and that helps hopefully the farmer by having data to demonstrate, like, because a lot of farmers come to us say, like, well, I'm growing these potatoes this way and they taste so much better, but I mean, don't know if it actually shows nutritionally. So we test it, and most of the time it works out. Sometimes it doesn't, right? That's also the nature of it. But typically our palates do guide us, right? If something tastes more
Yeah.
complex, those carrots that taste more complex, they probably contain more carotenoids. That's just the nature of it. Yeah.
Yeah, there's something going on in there. That's
Yeah,
real.
that's right. That's real. Yeah, and if we weren't able to pick up on that as humans, we'd probably died out a long time ago. But okay, having an actual number or sort of hard science behind it is, of course, helpful to inform customers. And so we've been doing that, doing a lot of running a lot of samples through our service lab as well. Which after a while, you have a big enough database, and it contributes to broader policy, right? If and this is how usually things move the needle. And then in terms of studies, we did a shorter term trial with regenerative versus conventional that we finished. It's currently under review. So we first got our first round of reviewer comments back for a good nutrition journal, and then we published a paper recently. It was really interesting, where for the first time amongst beef systems, we connected soil health, plant health, and animal health and human nutrition together in the same paper, and found these at least linkages. And then we're also now doing a longer term trial with 80 participants. The trial is 4 months long, feeding them grass-fed versus grain-fed, animal source foods or pastured versus non-pastured, because pork and poultry as well, and eggs. And looking at health outcomes there as well, because a lot of studies have been a little bit shorter with less amount of people. So it'd be a very large trial that we did. And then we got some grazing trials going on as well here, looking at monocultures versus polycultures, and the effects actually multi-generational. What happens to the calf if the mother is eating a very diverse diet versus a monoculture? It's grazing a monoculture. Does this impact the health of the calf? Wow. Because there's actually interesting work to suggest, and this is why it's also like, when I think about these things, and like I try to think of it like multi-generational, that maybe some of the things we do now, right? If I don't eat any more well, I always get some omega-3s, but if I don't eat any more DHA, EPA, and DPA, right, the sort of the animal omega-3 fatty acids or the fish fatty acids, nothing may happen in my lifetime, right? But what would happen multi-generational with my children or their children, right? If we stopped en masse of doing that, and that's where I think some of these things may play out, actually, is the multi-generational effect.
Wow, fascinating. So I just can't wait to see some of this research, especially those trials that you're talking about. And so really look forward to that. Thank you so much for all that you do. I'm a big fan of your work, and it's been really a big pleasure collaborating. So thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much, Ty.